So there's this new plugin, ezEdits, and I'm going to show you a little bit about it. ezEdits is a Worldedit FastAsynWorldedit extension plugin, which adds numerous new commands, patterns, masks, and tools to help you make amazing creations. Couldn't have said it better myself. Before I go anywhere else in this video, I will say you can try out this plugin for free on the Builder's Refuge or Bakery plot worlds, but if you would like to have this plugin for your own private server, you can donate to the developer and purchase a copy of it for yourself. I can leave links to all of these things in the description. It is an extension of Worldedit and FastAsynWorldedit, and offers various commands from texturing to generating to additional noise patterns, all kinds of stuff. But I'm just going to focus on one of the basic things about it in this video, and that is the palettes. A palette in ezEdits is just a list of blocks, much like you would make any kind of palette when building to use to color your builds. ezEdits comes with a number of predefined palettes that come with the plugin, but you can also create your own and save them to reuse them later. First, let me go over some of the basic palette commands just so you can see what I'm talking about. To place a palette, you're going to start typing ezPalette, then place, and the first list you see are all of the color palettes that come with ezEdits, anything that has 2 pound signs in front of it. When scrolling a little farther, I can see the ones I created myself that start with a single pound sign. That is important to note that the preset palettes have the 2 hashtags in front of them, always, and the ones that you create yourself will have a single one. This format stays true whenever you type out these palettes in any command. Let me place one of these predefined ones down just so you can see what it looks like. We'll do Fade Cyan, and we'll just enter that. It's going to place it directly in front of us, whichever direction we're facing, unless we define a direction for it to place next to us. I don't really see the purpose of placing it in an alternative direction, but if you want your palettes to be placed in a very specific way, you could do that when you place it. It does place it in the ground, so if you don't want it to do that, you're going to have to stand up one block and then place it on top of it like that. You can also create your own palettes and save them so that you can use them later. And there are several different ways to do this, but I'm going to show you how to do it with the fetch command. There are several different ways to do this. One way is to stand directly in front of your palette like this. The other way is to have your palette listed out in your hotbar. And the third way is you could have it selected. Any 3 of those ways will work when saving a palette. But when you have either of those 3 things done, then you're going to do ezPalette and fetch. And here is where you can tell it where it's fetching from. Is it fetching from your hotbar? Is it fetching from your selection? Or is it fetching from your world? And I come to find out world is basically from wherever you're standing. So as long as I'm standing on a row of blocks, it's going to grab that row of blocks as the palette. Any one of these will work in my current situation because I have all 3 of these met. I could say hotbar, and it's going to pull that palette directly from my hotbar. And it will also ignore any items that I have in there as well. After that, I'm going to enter a name for my palette. Since I grabbed these colors from the ezEdits logo, I'm just going to call it ezEdits. And that should save the new palette. It does say palette saved. Now there is another command that is ezPalette save, but fetch also works when saving a palette, plus it gives you more options. When fetching a palette, you do have the additional option of adding a length of blocks. So let's say I have all of these blocks in my hotbar, but I don't want to use all of them, maybe just the first 3. So then I'm just going to enter 3 for a length, and then it will only save that number of blocks. You can also define the direction of where you're fetching the blocks from, but by default, it would fetch them from wherever you're facing. But in this case, since I am taking them from the hotbar, that it doesn't really apply anyway. There's just a lot of different ways you can fetch things depending on where the blocks are located, but most of the time, you're going to be looking right at them. It's going to be pretty straightforward. And if you did want to overwrite something, you're just going to do -F to overwrite an existing one. So this time I'm changing it to be a distance of 3. And let me just show you what that does when I do that. I'm going to place this new palette that I made, and it's just got those 3 blocks. But that's not what I want. I just wanted to show you that you can define the length. Otherwise, if I want the whole thing, I'm just not going to define the length and do that. I forgot to overwrite it again. And now I can place that same one and then press enter to paste that in. In addition to doing the regular hashtag palette name, there are several other ways you can list out a palette. I'll go through some of these options. Using a comma, you can add additional palettes or individual blocks when listing out a palette name. If I do list a palette with additional blocks that aren't a part of that palette, it's just going to add them onto the end. I could also run this palette command by typing out all individual blocks with no preset palettes defined, and it would pull up those blocks for me. If you want to paste a palette in reverse order, you're just going to place a minus in front of it to invert that. If you would like to place just a select portion of a palette, then you're going to add parentheses at the end and have the start and end block of the palette that you want placed separated by a colon. If you would like to place a block or palette multiple times all at once, then you can multiply it by adding an asterisk and then the number of times you would like it to repeat for the command you're using. You can also group these in brackets if you want to apply one of the modifiers to the whole group. So if I wanted to invert both of them, then I would put them in a group of brackets. If I wanted to multiply both of them together, then I would put them in brackets and add the asterisk at the end. If you want to see all of the palettes that you have saved, you can easily do so by doing easy palette list, and you have the option of seeing all of them, the default ones or the ones that you've created. So I can do easy palette mine and see all of the palettes that I've created there. And if I don't want any of those anymore, I can just do easy palette to delete, then enter the name of the one that you want to delete, and it will go away. If for some reason you would like to grab all of the individual blocks from a palette, you can use the easy palette print followed by the palette name, and this will just list all of the blocks within that palette in the chat, and you can click and copy that and apply it to another command. I don't know what you would use this for, but it is something you can do. Adding -v at the end of this command will include block states when printing it to the chat. I want to show you some basic examples for how to use palettes with other commands, starting with the brushes. There's only 3 brushes currently with ezEdits, and they all relate to palettes. I textured this whole thing using the gradient brush and another palette shift brush, and I'm going to show you how to use those. And I just used this basic gradient right here that came with ezEdits. This is the Fade Gold palette. This one is another palette that I made myself, and I'm going to demonstrate how to use this gradient brush with this palette. I wanted to make sure that neither of these palettes had the same blocks because I'm going to show you how you can switch those out for another palette after you have it placed on your build. If I have these placeholder blocks and I want to paint over them, the first thing I'm going to have to do is Gmask those. So I'm just gonna mask the diamond block for this next palette. Now with a tool selected, I'm going to create my brush, and it's just going to be easy brush. It could be easy brush or easy BR, and then gradient. Since it's my palette I'm using, I just need a single pound sign, and then white gray, I believe is what it's called. Even though this autocomplete goes into the interpolation next, you can actually enter a brush radius next. I don't know if that's something that needs to be fixed or not, but the next thing to enter is a brush radius. I think if you don't define the radius, it's set to 8 by default. So even if I just set the interpolation, it's going to use a brush radius of 8, which is fine. I'm just going to set my radius to something a little bit bigger, like 15. And then you have your different interpolation types, and I can explain what those are to you. When it comes to the different interpolation types with the gradient brush, these are a good visual of what they look like with the default strength setting. So none, you get very straight lines across. Sine, you get slightly jagged edges. Linear is slightly more jagged edges, and Bezier is much more blended in. So if you want to use this as a quick reference, there you go. Take a screenshot of it, keep it for later. I'm going to keep this in my world for my own reference. So, once you know what interpolation you like, you can go ahead and select it. I usually like this one, it's just the easiest one. It has the best blending and it just looks nice. And the last thing you can enter is the strength. Default is 0.5, but it can be anywhere from 0 to 1 in strength. I'm not going to change it because I don't think I need to. And there are some flags for this as well, but I'm going to just enter this and use this as it is as a quick demonstration. When you create the brush, it's going to give you instructions in the chat for how to use it. Left click will create the start of your gradient. Right click will set the second point of the gradient, and then you're going to right click again to start painting the gradient. So you're going to right click twice in a row essentially. There are other things you can do as well if you just read those instructions. I'm just showing you the basics right now for how to do the basic gradient. Now remember, I have my G mask set to diamond, and I'm not sure exactly which direction this gradient is going to go, if it's going to use the darkest gray as the second point or the first point. So I'm just going to try it out and see which direction it's going first. So let's say I want to do this piece of the wing separate from these other pieces, and I want this part here to be very bright, the bright white, and I want to go into the gray down here. So I'm going to click one point up there for one end of the gradient by left clicking. Then I'm going to right click down there. And if I enable my Worldedit CUI, you can see the line that it's making. So now that I have those points selected, I'm going to right click again to start painting this palette onto those blocks. Now I did click this on this side, and that's just defining the angle of my gradient. If I wanted to do a completely separate angle, I can reset those. So let's say I want to do the neck over here. I could do light to dark over there and then paint in that direction. Now I could go to the other side and continue to paint over here, but it's keeping that same angle that I had selected last time. If I ever want the angle to change, I'm just going to have to left click and right click again, and then right click a second time to paint that on there. And let me go ahead and finish the rest of this. I'm just going to create a basic guideline here. We'll just say light on that side, and then it will gradually get darker as it gets towards these back hind legs. But see how it's being consistent with the gradient? So with it stretched from there to there, it's putting the darkest parts on these back legs, and it gets brighter and brighter as it gets up to the head. So however you want to define that angle, you can do it. I just realized my poor horse has these holes in it, and I don't know why, so I'm fixing it right now because it's bothering me. Remember I said there were multiple flags you could do with this? Well, I'm going to show them to you now. The first thing though I'm going to do is disable my G mask. When you don't have a G mask enabled and you have your points defined, it's just going to act like a replace, where it's going to replace over any existing blocks. That is how it normally works without any set G mask. However, if you add the -A flag to this command, it's going to treat it now where it will also paste over air blocks, not ignoring them anymore. And it's going to basically turn it into a regular sphere brush. So now I could have that same point defined for the gradient, but now it's going to be placing actual spheres in that gradient. There is also -V, which deactivates the Worldedit CUI integration. I think all this does is it would prevent this from updating in Worldedit CUI, because as you can see, I can select new points. The new points are being defined, but my visualizer thing is not updating to that. I don't understand the purpose of it, but it is there nonetheless. Then there is also the -N for noise. So you could add custom noise to this by following all of these other additional options. I'm not going to get into those, but if you didn't want to stick with the standard interpolation, you could get more detailed by actually adding a noise to your brush. I'm not knowledgeable enough to explain all of these noise types. I think this is one of those things you're just going to have to experiment with and see if you can figure out how it works best for you. The -Z flag allows you to adjust the scale of the noise, so I assume this only works if you're using it with the -N flag and a noise type. Then there is the -D flag, which allows you to change to different distance function modes that will basically change the type of shape you are brushing onto a surface. Here's a brief example of what it does. We'll just go down these in order. If we do the cube, pay attention to where we have the first point, because the first point is defining the center of this shape and the second point is defining the outside of it. And if we continue to brush, you'll see that it is making this cube shape. If we change this to be the Manhattan distance function, it's going to be slightly different. Set new points, and you'll see it's creating more of a diamond shape across the grid. If we didn't want any kind of distance function, there's also none, and this is just the default, what it normally does, which is basically just creating a straight line of a gradient. Then finally, there's sphere, which makes a shape you might expect. When we start painting on this gradient, you'll see it creates the shape of a circle with the first point being in the center. And that's what the distance function flag does. Much like the gradient brush, we also have the gradient stroke brush. I'm just going to edit my existing command here and change this to gradient stroke. And it's got all the same parameters as the other one. This is the only part you'd have to change if you wanted this type of brush. You can read in the chat how this one works differently from the other one. You left click to add points, multiple points. You sneak left click to remove the last one, right click to place the gradient stroke, and sneak right click to clear all points. This is useful if you want your gradient to bend in any way. I can keep selecting points with left click, and then I'm going to click right click once, and it's going to make a gradient following that zigzag pattern. How cool is that? And if I wanted to apply it to this lapis, I think first I want to pick a different palette to use. So we're using something a little different. I'm going to try the ezEdits one that we had because I know those blocks are different. If I did this with ezEdits and I gmasked the lapis, then I could make it zigzag around and say there, 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 and enter that. There we go. It didn't reach the whole way around because our brush size was only 15. The gradient stroke brush uses all of the same flags as the gradient brush. So -A will include air whenever you do add a stroke. So it's just going to act like a curve command, but with the gradient applied. Then there's also the -N, which is the noise function, and the -V, which is the visualizer for Worldedit, disabling it essentially. And then there is the -Z for the noise scale, if you are using a noise pattern. Then -D, which is a little bit different from the gradient brushes because you don't have to enter anything after this. You just do that by itself. And what that's going to do is it's going to keep the gradient then coming from the center line of the stroke. So instead of the gradient starting from there and ending there, it's going to start in the middle and then end on the outside of the line. So that's pretty cool. There is one more brush currently with ezEdits that I would like to show you, and that's the palette shift brush. This is how I was able to get this palette to be darker and lighter in different spots without keeping to that linear fashion. I'm going to go back to this brush that I had, and I'm going to change this to be the palette shift brush. And for this one, there is no interpolation. You just select the palette that you want to shift, and then you have the brush radius. I'll keep this smaller. How about something smaller like 8? Then you're going to enter a shift number. So the palette shift brush is basically saying, when I paint over this, I want the blocks to shift by this many number of blocks. So if I did this with a shift of 1, it's going to shift the blocks by 1 block in the palette, in the area that I'm painting over. You can also go in the negatives if you want to go the opposite direction, but you can choose however many number of blocks in the palette you want it to shift by. I can show an extreme example of 7 just as the initial example, but normally I would do something like 1, so I'm not shifting too much at once. But here, I'm going to enter 7 on it right now. Since I defined white-gray as the palette that I'm shifting, it's only going to shift the blocks in that palette right here. I also need to make sure my G mask is turned off. So then I can right click on here and it's going to shift any blocks in this palette by 7. Now, these darker ones, they can only go so far before they hit the darkest block in the palette. But these ones up here, you can see they're shifting down the palette as much as they can. So 7 is a very extreme example. If I make this shift by 1 block at a time, now it's going to gradually make things darker by going 1 block down on the palette. So I could make this part darker if I wanted to. I can make the whole thing darker if I really wanted to, because it's all within this palette. And if I wanted to add a highlight to this, I can say shift by -1, and let's make the size really small, 3. So now I could shift things up the palette and make them brighter. It's like an advanced brighten and darken from FastAsynWorldedit. This is much better because you can define the palette that it's using to create the bright and dark effect on your build. I can see myself using this instead of the lighten and darken in the future because you have a lot more control with it. I have a few more commands to show you about palettes. I can't cover everything, but I have too many I want to cover in this video that I can't not do it. For this next one, you will need a selection around your build. These are the 2 palettes I have up there. If we wanted to swap one of those for another palette, we can do that very easily with the Easy Palette Swap. And what I need to do is first say which palette we are swapping from. So let's start with the faded gold. That was the one that I had originally on the wings. So let's do fade gold. We're going to swap that out for another palette. We could pick maybe fade cyan. And it's going to switch all of those blocks in that palette to the other blocks in the other defined palette. Or if we wanted it to be the ezEdits one that we made, we could also do that. This one doesn't have as many blocks to work with in the palette as this one. The ezEdits one was much smaller, so as a result, we don't get as much of the dynamic range in the gradient. So you're going to have to swap it with a palette that has equally as much range as the one you're swapping from if you care that much. We could try one of these. I know some of these don't have tons. You could do the legacy wool, which is basically every single wool block. You can do that and you could get something really colorful. But anyway, it's really easy to just swap colors out. I'm just trying to be careful to pick something that doesn't cross over with my white one. I think this one doesn't cross over, so if I wanted to turn that green for some reason, and if I wanted to change my other one, my white gray, to something else, I could say white gray 2. I could do the faded blue or whatever. It's going to switch anything in my white gray palette to that fade blue. I liked the original colors better, but that's the palette swap command, a very efficient way to test out different colors on your build. You can also use a palette directly as a mask or a pattern within ezEdits. When using it as a mask, you're going to define that you are masking a palette by doing #palette and then entering the palette you want to mask in brackets. So if you want to replace all of the blocks within a palette with another type of block, you could do that very easily with this. Or if you wanted to mask it for any other reason. I'm just lightly touching on this to make you aware it's there, but I would like to cover all of the masks in this plugin more thoroughly in the future. You can also use palettes as a pattern, much like the mask. However, when using this palette pattern, it's going to place the blocks in a randomized fashion, much like if you were listing out all of the blocks individually and separating them by commas. So it's not going to make a nice gradient, it's just going to randomize all of those blocks within that palette, but that is how it works as a pattern option. There are other pattern types within ezEdits, but I'll have to save all of those for another video. I know this video was a huge information dump, but I wanted to cover as many of the different palette commands as I could in one video. There are some other amazing tools with this plugin that I will have to cover in the future, but I thought this was a good starting point for covering the basics of just palettes in general, since I know they can be used in other commands also. Let me know what you think, and if you do plan on using this, I think it's a very fun plugin. Not quite as easy at first, but once you get the hang of it, it does make building much easier, that's for sure. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have fun building.